Dungeon 42. By S. Jackson. Chapter 145. Career. Felix Swiftpaw was a great many things, in his right mind wasn't presently one of them. A gorgeous map in hand, he'd set out on the request of Heta to make contact with a hermit living at the foot of the Laurel Mountains. A strange choice of location at the best of times, standing as a natural barrier to the demon lands as they did. Getting out of Stronghold wasn't terribly hard, the border patrol wasn't one for imagination. Felix had simply waited until night and used his better low-light vision to sneak between patrols. Passing through the Marrowwane swamp to get to Heta's camp had been more difficult. The swamp wasn't well mapped, and even if it had been, she'd hidden off the known trails. A precaution natural to someone on the lam from the entirety of a kingdom. Marrowwane wasn't close even to the worst place Felix had ever traversed for business or pure curiosity. The humidity had been uncomfortable, but it was the biting insects that had been the annoying bit. Despite his normally protective pelt, they'd seemed to nestle in and find the softer skin beneath without error. Wandering now in a trackless desert, Felix knew he was supposed to be doing something. What exactly, he wasn't sure, but it was important. Or he'd thought it was, possibly been told it was. His mind refused to yield any kind of coherent answer, and he waved the nuanced thoughts off like he had the insects. Following the map at the very least was something he had to do. No matter what else might or might not be true about his mission, Felix needed to find the location marked on the map. That was where the map maker would be. The map maker whose feet he planned to prostrate himself at and beg to be taken apprentice by. That catkin weren't built for desert travel, like everything else, was a thought Felix didn't register. No more than the dismal amount of food and water he'd been ingesting. His journey was all that mattered, his body was secondary. He felt no particular need for those basic staples of existence. As if in tune with his quest, he carried on for hours tirelessly. Distorted thoughts crystallizing, the euphoria keeping Felix afloat started to fade. He'd come to an entrance of sorts, one leading into a natural stone labyrinth. This place had a look of danger to it, unlike the unremembered places he'd passed through before. Felix shivered as he entered, his lips feeling strangely numb and his body slick with sweat matted his fur. Something was wrong, had to be, and this certainty was accompanied by a feeling of eyes. He was being watched as he progressed through the shade of the stones. Moment to moment, Felix's certainty of being watched by something malignant grew. Something silent that managed to flit soundlessly from shadow to shadow among the stones. He couldn't guess its size, it moved too fast for him to see more than a flickering at the edge of his vision. What he did know on a primal level was it was hungry. Having no interest in becoming the beast's sustenance, Felix took off running. Heedless of the screaming of his body and the lack of any idea where he was going, he went as fast as he could. A speed more than ill-advised in such terrain, as he scraped between obstacles or slammed into them, only to keep going. Felix could hear the tearing of cloth and leather as his clothes and gear, already in a sorry state, were tattered further. He didn't care and kept on, knowing only death awaited him if he stopped. The thing in pursuit wanted him, flesh and bone, and he knew it as surely as the flavor of sunlight. Map in hand, Felix ran, hardly registering when he saw and subsequently ran into a man in a fighter's gear. One who looked puzzled and was entirely too light for his apparent size as he was pushed aside far too easily. He'd have laughed at the expression if he wasn't being chased by death incarnate. Felix hazily realized he was surrounded on three sides, having run into a blind alley. Retreat was impossible, but he could see a cave ahead. He didn't want to take shelter, death would only find him all the quicker. Still, it was possible it would provide an exit. Hearing the beast grow closer, his heart pounding hard enough to deafen him, Felix dove for the cave. A moment later he wasn't engulfed in the darkness of the earth, but lying on his back. The sky above him was a painfully bright knife slash of whirling shades of blue. The man Felix had run into was there again, gazing down at him. Still curious rather than upset, his blue eyes almost as bright as the sky. Beside him an orange-eyed child stood, face scrunched in incredulity. Or possibly a very small woman. "What the fuck?" someone asked. The voice not seeming to issue from either person Felix could see. A soft poke caught his attention and he was just barely able to turn his head and see a violet-eyed human woman. One who was poking him with a stick for some reason. How very impolite. Who throws themselves head first into a wall, the little woman said. Felix tried to move, to get up and offer his name, as that seemed like an invitation to introduce himself. Instead, he just let out a weak and pained groan. "Everything hurt, to the point where his body felt like a prolonged scream of agony and he was hot. As if he were boiling beneath his skin. "Think he'll get up again?" one of them asked. "No point in waiting to see. I imagine the mistress will want to talk to him and we'd best hurry or he'll die like this," the little woman said. Felix felt no small amount of annoyance at the insinuation that he'd die. As far as he was concerned, he'd just outrun death. So he could only wonder at the hubris of this little thing who dared suggest his whole body being on fire internally would do the task instead. It was an annoyance he wasn't able to give voice as unconsciousness claimed him once more. Chapter 146. Strange Awakening. When consciousness decided to grace Felix once more, it came with a bizarre feeling. Rather than hay or a hard floor, he felt as if he was laying on what he'd always assumed clouds would feel like. Yieldingly soft but springy enough he didn't feel anything hard through it. A soft buzz of conversation was audible to him, but Felix wasn't inclined to surrender the pleasant feeling he was experiencing. The half-remembered agony he'd felt before was gone and he rolled onto his side and fell asleep. It wasn't until much later he woke properly, sunlight softly insisting he not lay about any further. Opening his eyes, Felix found himself looking up at a timber ceiling and still incredibly comfortable. Far too comfortable. A soft exclamation sounded and he found himself ringed by curious faces. Human faces. "You lot, stop crowding him," a low female voice called. Obligingly, the people around Felix backed up and started shuffling out of the room. Once they were gone, he found himself faced with a curiosity. She looked like a muscular human woman, but her eyes were golden. The woman didn't wear a collar, but that coloration wasn't human. Felix felt certain she had to be a demi-human, though perhaps from a diluted bloodline. Not that it would likely matter. Since she could pass for human, she might as well be one. "I'm Dawn, head of the Adventurers Guild," Dawn said. She came closer and strangely looked for permission before taking a seat on a stool next to the bed. She was dressed well, in an impressive leather coat with metal plates. If forced to say, Felix thought she looked like a particularly rich mercenary. That still didn't explain why Felix was in a private room, of all things. Taking in the details of her coat, of which there was a lot, he realized what he was doing and wanted to slap himself. It was a bad habit of his, getting lost in things that struck his curiosity. He needed to focus and find out where he was and how much trouble he was in. "Felix Swiftpaw, at your service," Felix responded a bit late. He had to make a conscious effort to smile without showing his teeth. Like keeping his ears up and forwards regardless of his mood, it was an affectation he'd adopted to smooth his interactions with humans. One he was struggling to keep up as his focus wavered dangerously. Dawn's eyes and her interesting title didn't matter. She could pass for human and that meant she'd almost certainly act like one. That didn't bode well for Felix, who felt an unusual lightness at his throat. One hand going discreetly to his neck, Felix confirmed his fear. The false slave collar he normally wore was absent. The fate of other demi-humans who'd been caught without one flashed through his mind and his blood ran cold. The chaining hadn't been a kind event, but it was merciful in comparison to what happened to those caught later on. "Right, well, you ought to rest a few days before you worry about service. You were in a mad state when you were found," Dawn said, waving off the idea. Felix froze. What little he could remember of the time before he woke did tally with the idea of him being ill. Rather extremely, though the fact he felt fine struck him as deeply strange. He ought to have woken up in pain if he were recovering. Instead, he felt as if nothing had ever been wrong. "The disease that afflicted you has already been dealt with by the hermit," Dawn continued, oblivious to Felix's turmoil. "Wait, hermit?" Felix asked. The word stood out even as his mind raced. "The hermit of Laurel. Heta sent you, yes?" Dawn asked. Her expression was curious but not upset. "Yes," Felix answered, as a few of his memories clarified slightly. Before he'd taken ill or whatever had happened, he'd accepted an assignment from Heta, a Lapusan woman who'd spoken of a hermit willing to shelter demi-humans beyond Stromolt's reach. That he'd managed to actually reach his destination rather than simply die was a stroke of luck in Felix's mind. He certainly hadn't been in a fit state to undertake the journey. "Good. It's too bad you got sick, but at least you made it," Dawn said, nodding. "I was following a map, one with astounding detail," Felix explained. A whisper of his prior reverence crept up. Dawn flinched, then nodded. "It's with your things in the wardrobe. The hermit will want to talk with you eventually, but for now, rest up and eat," Dawn said, as she stood up. Felix moved to stand, but Dawn waved him off. Her behavior from beginning to end was nearly senseless to him. She acted like there was no disparity in their standing. A puzzle he didn't linger on, as an unfamiliar but tantalizing scent caught his attention. Looking over, Felix found himself gazing at a table covered in a haphazard collection of foods. The kinds he'd largely only seen at a distance, rather than partaken of. What it lacked in a coherent theme, it made up for in beauty and he suspected taste, if the smell was anything to go by. He was looking at a feast, one fit for a particularly rich king if he wasn't off the mark. Felix missed the actual moment of Dawn's departure as he simply stared. He had to still be asleep and dreaming or dead and in a much better afterlife than he'd ever envisioned. Either way, there were pastries in the mix and he was definitely going to try one, dreaming or not. The first bite was good, but sickeningly sweet after a moment. Catkin were meat eaters primarily, but it didn't stop Felix trying a small bite from every pastry on the table. He felt a little ill by the time he was done, but he didn't regret it. With that out of the way, he waited a while before treating himself to a more appropriate dish. Thinly sliced fish of some kind in a very light sauce that, while a little sweet, didn't disagree with him as the pastries had. He ate his fill, and felt better as the hunger he hadn't previously acknowledged subsided. Hands and muzzle a mess, Felix washed up in the provided basin and decided to change his clothes. Someone had lent him a long tunic to sleep in and had to have bathed him while he was unconscious. Even without being ill, his clothes and fur had likely been in a sorry state. Opening the wardrobe he found his things laid out neatly and a faint herbal scent wafting from them. Or rather clothes surprisingly similar to his own. He used a gentle touch with his things, but they hadn't been nearly so nice as the ones he was looking at, even when they were new. If not for the tail hole in the pants and the peculiarities of the cut, he might have thought they were meant for someone else. Someone rich. After changing his clothes, Felix felt refreshed and started taking an inventory of all the goods in the various drawers. He found more things that looked distressingly similar to, but were not his original equipment. All of his things were accounted for, even if they weren't really his, and a few were even added. The hair along Felix's spine stood up at attention. The entire situation was strange. Not unpleasant, but strange enough to leave him feeling uneasy nonetheless. Heta must have been more influential than he'd realized, or this hermit he was meant to see was more than a poor eccentric living in the mountains like most of their ilk. One odd thing was a hard leather tube with a strap. It took Felix a moment to realize what it was, a scroll or map tube. They were expensive things, though not even a tenth the cost of their precious cargo. Though he himself was a cartographer, he'd never been able to risk owning one. A demi-human with that kind of money invited questions he wouldn't survive answering. The tube reminded Felix of the map and he opened it eagerly. Instead of the expected parchment, he found it empty. Surprised and rather annoyed he searched the wardrobe and a nearby set of drawers which finally turned up something. A strange little threefold of paper formed into a triangle. Maps weren't drawn on anything so delicate as paper, so Felix discarded the idea even as he began to open it. He was too curious to let a mystery like that remain unexplored. After a few moments he found he'd been incorrect, it was in fact a map. The one he'd been on verge of worshipping before he'd totally lost his mind. That masterfully crafted map was folded multiple times. What rat-tailed, buck-toothed, brainless, worthless, faithless, Felix snarled as he continued unfolding. Laying the map out on the floor, he quickly took stock of the damage. What bastard folded a map? Much less this map, he continued in a growl. The folds themselves were unnaturally neat and crisp. Parchment usually didn't like to bend in the first place and would break apart randomly along the fold. Paper too didn't crease well, but this paper was strange. Thick but supple, almost like a cloth. Felix didn't recall much about the map or its materials before he'd taken ill. He tried to think if it had been given to him in such a state or if the damage had happened later. That was when a thought struck him that he wouldn't normally have considered. Did I fold it? Felix asked himself aloud. Dawn had said he was mad when he was found. If he'd been crazed enough not to remember crossing a desert, then it was possible. Detestable, but possible. Felix shivered as the lack of an alternate explanation weighed on him. Of all of the colorful and ill-advised things he'd done in his thus far brief life, it would be the chiefest of his sins if he'd really folded the map. Not because of its quality, but simply because he knew how much work went into making even bad ones. Studying the map for a few more minutes, Felix felt himself relax a bit. The folds were far neater than anything he'd ever bother with, even in his right mind. He doubted being addled by fever had suddenly made him masterful at folding things. It was more likely he'd been given the map in that state and simply didn't remember. Returning to his study of the map, this time Felix focused on actually looking at its content properly. It didn't take long for his shoulders to droop as he realized what he was looking at. The borders were accurate, likely traced from other maps. Beyond that though, the rest was a lovely painting in the style of a map. Felix groaned, wondering how ill he'd truly been, given he'd been fawning over the ridiculous art piece. Rather than depicting the general outline of the demon territories, it had the world end where they began and the rest was a fanciful depiction of the land of the gods. Maps hadn't depicted that seriously for 200 years. The one Felix was looking at clearly wasn't an antique but was perhaps a reproduction. It wasn't a good map, but it did cover enough ground accurately to work for his assignment. Really, using it to obscure the location of the Hermit's Valley and the surrounding nonsense was rather smart. Though he was done with it, Felix couldn't bring himself to fold the map back up. Instead, he found a clear bit of table and laid some of his spare clothes on it to encourage the creases to straighten out. A needless thing to do, but one he couldn't stop himself from. Maps were to be rolled with respect, even copies of crazy old ones. Chapter 147. Achievements. Since I was officially barred from interacting with the mortal occupants of the valley, aside from Elim's family, I was watching Dawn talk to Felix through the security system. Thus far the catkin was making a good recovery. The potions I'd supplied had dealt with the disease immediately, as well as most of his other physical issues. The fact he'd been way too skinny to start with would take more time. I don't understand why his map data for a few weeks is worth so much, Henry admitted. It was the main thing I was after and what Dawn was trying to get. He's patient zero, I replied. There was a long pause in the wake of my words. What the fuck is a zero patient? Chris asked loudly. I hadn't realized he'd come in, but wasn't surprised to see him lounging with a can of chaos and a book on a beanbag. It was technically part of the decor from Andrea's room, but I'd just made another when he'd stolen and dragged that one into the Palace of Shadows. It's the first person to contract a disease. He had to get it from the source, which is likely near Dr. Satan's dungeon, if not part of it. The time frame is when he would have contracted and incubated the disease plus travel time, I explained. That disturbing little nugget of information had been listed like a fucking achievement in Felix's data. At the start of things I'd actually wanted more, all of his map data, but Felix hadn't played ball. Though it wasn't his primary occupation, he was a cartographer and wasn't about to part with that kind of information easily. Satan is such a stupid fucking name, Chris muttered, turning back to his book. I couldn't help but laugh at that. It would sound pretty dumb to anyone who didn't have even a passing knowledge of Judeo-Christian lore. It's such a strange thing to know how such afflictions move. I'd been taught W was foul air that spread it, Henry said, only half paying attention to the negotiations. It sort of can, but air itself can't spontaneously become disease-bearing. It has to be exhaled by an infected person, and not all diseases pass that way, I offered. Henry's understanding of the idea was pretty common among the skeletons and some of the cultures of my own former world. It can carry poison too, Chris chimed in with a sage nod. I gave him a look that he ignored. That information was definitely work-related rather than academic. What do you intend to do if you find out where Dr. Satan is? Henry inquired. Kill him, I said flatly. Wait, what? Chris asked, rolling out of his seat and scrambling to his feet. Once I know where he is, I'll figure out how to kill him, I explained. You're lying? Having me on? Chris asked, peering into my orbs as if he suspected a head injury. Chris, leaving aside the fact he's a plague rat, I don't see a reason to put up with another dungeon close by, I offered by way of explanation. There was more to it, a kind of instinctive knowledge conflict was inevitable, but it wasn't relevant. I had plenty of reason even without some kind of territorial instinct kicking in. This I like, Chris said, grinning. You need to be like this more often. Like what? I asked, honestly confused. I wasn't acting any differently than normal in my estimation. It was the circumstances that were unusual. Decisive, brutal, Chris replied, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. I felt irritated with the idea immediately. So I should have killed Andrea for points? I asked. It was a low blow and I could see it hit home with startling clarity. Chris froze, whatever joke or foul comment he'd been about to make lost. A pop-up and chime appeared, startling us both. I had everything in share mode for the moment. It seemed Dawn's negotiations had borne fruit while I wasn't looking. The deal on offer looked a bit lopsided if one were unaware of how the system worked and why I wanted the information. Not that I really cared about some money and supplies. While I was confirming the deal, Chris took that moment to make a hasty exit. I didn't try to stop him. It hadn't been my intention to upset him, but I couldn't say I minded him realizing brutality had a cost in opportunities. You couldn't make deals with or befriend the dead, at least not without some fairly serious system intervention like with him and the rest of the Bone Brigade. Think that was too harsh? I asked Henry. Not particularly, Henry said, but his expression turned thoughtful. If you never challenge him, he won't think and grow, let alone change. Fair, I just hope this doesn't result in a property damage spree, I said with a shrug of my own. That is a valid concern, Henry agreed. We both sighed at that, but I didn't pop into the security feed to check. Even if Chris was, I'd let him work it out of his system so long as he wasn't bothering anyone. There honestly wasn't much he could break or deface I couldn't fix with a few moments of thought. Putting that aside, I'm going to call a meeting about dealing with Dr. Satan. Bloody Mana fever, going by the information I have on it, first appeared a few years ago. Since it's dungeon made, that means he's had time to dig in and build up his defenses, I explained. That wouldn't be a problem if you could send us, given the training we've done, Henry said. I nodded and wished it was that easy. I can pair anyone interested with one of my mortal contractors, but I haven't got enough for the team size I'd want to use, I said unhappily. There were reasons to favor a smaller group, but they didn't apply when my goal was simple annihilation. Elim was the only Guardian-enabled contractor I had at present. That could change easily. Tiller was likely to ask me for a deal again, but I wanted 5 mortals so the team would total at 10. The others who were aware of me weren't likely to want to change their contracts to help, with the exception of Andrea. I wasn't entirely opposed to the idea of letting Andrea participate in a raid against Dr. Satan, but it wasn't my favorite option. She needed to work her personal problems out and develop better teamwork skills before I'd be comfortable with it. Under slightly different circumstances it would have been a non-issue to leave Andrea out of the initial talks. Unfortunately, at present that would either require asking Chris to keep something from her, or excluding him and ordering everyone else not to tell him anything. Both options seemed like they'd just breed more problems than they solved, so I invited Andrea myself. Honesty might not always yield the desired result, but it couldn't be beat in terms of simplicity. Chapter 148. War Room. It was several hours later when I finished up some home improvements of my own in the Palace of Shadows and the dungeon denizens started to arrive. I'd edited the old arrangement, adding longer couches and a decorative rug to accommodate the larger-than-normal crowd I expected. There was also a low table for the dramatic unfurling of maps with some cups of chaos beverage on it. Skeletons started taking seats immediately, but I noticed two someones hanging back by the entrance. Andrea looked apprehensive, while Chris seemed to be trying to talk her through it. They made it fully into the room, only to stall a second time. Andrea, feel free to have a seat, I said in a neutral tone, gesturing at the couch. I'd gone for a high-end lounge vibe and hoped it made the space a little less intimidating than it would have been otherwise. Not sure a mortal would like or be able to safely consume chaos beverage, I placed some different drink options near Andrea. She took a cup of cider and I made a point of not paying too much attention to her while she settled in. Everyone aside from Chris and Andrea mingled and chatted a bit before finding seats. Once they did, all eyes turned toward me curiously. Fun stuff, being the center of attention. As most of you are aware, our latest arrival, Felix, was ill. He'd contracted an illness created by another dungeon, Dr. Satan, I began. Most of the assembly knew some of the facts, so no one looked lost. I'd been pretty good about letting them know when I found out things thus far, and it was paying off. Because he was the first victim, he likely contracted it very close to the dungeon, so Dawn bargained with him for his map data, I continued. Was it any help in locating them? Dawn asked. I smiled at her. It was the question I'd been hoping she'd ask for. Dramatically, the table vanished and the floor beneath it lowered a few inches, then split. It opened to reveal a detailed relief carving of the map and rose up to the height the table had been. I could almost hear a howl of outrage from Felix that he wouldn't get to see it. I'd been anxiously waiting for the meeting and spent my nervous energy on presentation props. The bits of flooring I was just moving myself with the system. Eventually, it would be cool to put in a mechanism to cause it to do the same with all the whining and gear noises. My method was silent and underwhelming to my own eyes. The rest of the room didn't share my lack of enthusiasm. Shit. Andrea hopped back, half climbing up the back of the couch. She was a beat slow. Chris was already behind it, peering suspiciously at what was being revealed. The rest of the skeletons tried to behave in a more dignified fashion, while Henry was biting back laughter. He'd yelped the first time when I'd been practicing my little trick before the meeting. Felix traded his map data for the weeks just before he was infected until he reached here, I said serenely, pointing at a glowing red line painted on the topography. He'd only made the concession because those places were already on regular maps. Despite his position, he still had a craftsman's pride concerning map making. He wouldn't give up new discoveries easily. I kept my orbs on the display and let Chris and Andrea climb back into their seats. They both looked sheepish and I didn't feel a need to add to their embarrassment, though I'd found it cute. I'd possibly tease them about it later though. Gently. Probably. Based on what the disease's data said, he'd have been infected somewhere in this area, I said as I drew a small glowing green circle around an X. Using my interface caused it to seem to appear out of nowhere. This didn't shock anyone but Andrea. I didn't have to be in physical contact with an object to effect changes, though the closer I was the easier it was to control. I was enjoying being dramatic. It's not a small space to explore, but because he was the first victim, the exact date of his infection was marked in his information, which means it happened around here, I explained. It had been recorded like an achievement, which was almost as awful as it was useful. The date had been given, but not the time, and the catkin moved fast. It was still a much smaller area to search than the 3 days' worth of his travel that matched with the estimate based on the incubation time. Particularly since he'd been following a narrow road through a swamp. He hadn't deviated from it, so the inflection points were limited. What do you intend to do with this knowledge, mistress? Brun asked. I want to find and kill Dr. Satan, I said simply. Chris looked away at that, but the rest of the denizens looked like they approved. They also didn't seem inclined to question my motives. How? Silver asked. When I form contracts, I can grant a guardian to a mortal. Essentially, I plan to foster a group of adventurers and anyone interested can partner up with them and then raid the other dungeon, I explained. Since I was planning to lure them to the valley anyway, it wouldn't hurt to get a little more use out of them. Can I? Andrea asked. That was a question I'd been hoping to dodge for the moment, but was prepared for. Possibly. We'll have to see who else we get to do it. I'm going to prioritize party needs and teamwork, but if you commit to the group training you should be able to if you want, I said simply. Andrea didn't look happy, but didn't seem to have a way to refute what I'd said either. My preparations had paid off. What's the catch? Dawn asked. He's had at least 3 years to dig in and build up his defenses. I also can't predict what his style is like or what type of creatures he'll employ. Unless someone else has been in there and lived to tell the tale, the team will be flying blind for the initial run, I admitted. That was another reason not to want to use Andrea or Elim in the attack group, particularly not for the first run. I could provide a great deal of support, but it wasn't infallible. If something went sufficiently wrong they'd be on their own. So step 1 will be getting more people in the valley. Anyone interested in taking part in the raid should scout them to see if you can find someone you want to partner with, I continued, wanting to get the main points done with. That means the first attempt is months out, at the earliest, but it's something to keep in mind. Since a deal is involved, that means they find out about you, Jeffrey said a touch sternly. Yeah, it's unavoidable really, I agreed. A workaround had been found with Felix, but I doubted that would work for the more in-depth contract the raid team would need. Keep that in mind when you're considering someone. Do you believe they can be trusted? Henry offered. So, aside from answering any questions you might have, that's it for this meeting, I said. The group broke into quiet conversations at that point, but nothing was directed toward me. They all filtered out slowly, still talking in low serious tones, though I didn't miss the odd gleeful expression. Nothing like the prospect of a raid to get them excited it seemed. Chapter 149. Marawane. After leaving the Laurel Mountains and 42S Valley, things had not been easy for Heta or Myra. A predictable consequence of trying to establish contact with the scattered Labyrinth. They had made camp in the Marawane swamp and were waiting for Felix Swiftpaw to return. Unlike them, Felix had connections with other groups and traveled both before and after the chaining. He would be able to vouch for the existence of the valley and hopefully sway the more reluctant groups to at least consider visiting. Or so Heta hoped. They'd gotten in contact with a band of Lepusan who were sending a scouting party, but that was all so far. It was a start, but also symptomatic of the lack of a sense of commonality between the groups. The Lupe hadn't even entertained a visit from them, refusing to have business with a herbivore. Myra muttered, rousing Heta from her thoughts. Hey Bright Eyes, Heta said softly. She pressed a cool cloth to Myra's forehead. Myra had been using her powers too much and hiding her exhaustion. She'd ended up collapsing without warning, and it had only been luck it happened when they had made it back to the camp. Heta had been beside herself with worry, but didn't chide. She understood why Myra had done it even if she didn't agree. She'd simply vowed to be more mindful of how often she used her powers and force more frequent rest breaks going forward. We're taking the day off, Heta said flatly. Bun, I'm fine, Myra whined. Heta just huffed at that, doubting her lover would be able to get out of bed even if she wanted to. The fact she wasn't trying just to make a point proof enough she was in no condition to go tramping about the countryside anytime soon. You slept for 2 days, Heta countered. Besides, we have to wait for Felix and he'll be there a while. He was ill when he arrived. Fine, but no talk about me going back to the valley, Myra grumped. Heta nodded, though it wasn't far from her mind. Things had been harder than she expected when they left. The fact Myra was still committed to the mission despite everything made Heta smile. As a human she could have left at any moment, and her abilities as a seer would have had any kingdom with sense welcoming her warmly. Instead, she was slogging right alongside Heta through a god's forsaken swamp. I said it once, and I meant for us to go together, Heta said and laughed. It had been at the end of their first month after leaving. 42 had mentioned having added buildings to the valley in anticipation of future occupants. That had piqued Heta's curiosity as well as seemed like a good opportunity to lay low and rest for a bit. Myra hummed, seeming half asleep once more. Heta wanted to help her people, but she wasn't delusional enough to think it would simply come together because she wanted it to. It would take time, and that meant they could occasionally rest, and certainly should. They weren't going to be fit to help anyone if they ran themselves ragged. Too far for Myra to hear even awake, Heta picked up the sound of a fake goose call. It was coming from the direction of the road. I'll be back soon, love, Heta said softly. She didn't leave immediately though, lingering and watching her lover's grumpy sleeping face. Like someone in her dreams had stolen the last fruit tart at the tower. Heta was fast once she did leave, taking up a spear and short bow as she went. It wasn't likely an agent of Stronghold had found them, but it wasn't wise to assume. Thick vegetation and boggy ground hid their camp from even keen human senses, but they might use tracking dogs. It wasn't until Heta found a wolf-eared man standing on the road that she relaxed a little. He was entirely shirtless, with only a breechcloth for modesty's sake. No slave collar in sight. I know you're their rabbit. Fang Sen's word, the man who'd never given a name growled out. He tossed a letter down on the dirt of the road, then transformed fully into a wolf. A wolf already running back along the road the way it had come. Fucker, Heta muttered to herself. As bleak as it was, his behavior was an improvement over the last time she'd seen him. At the time he'd refused to change so they might speak and showed his teeth at her. Something which wasn't an idle threat from his kind. After a little time passed and Heta was certain the wolf was truly gone, she retrieved the letter. We don't believe you, but we'll send scouts. A single line hastily scrawled on leather. It was more than Heta had been hoping for, but that wasn't much. Her own people were doing much the same, but it was to find out how many of their band the valley could take. They hadn't believed Heta when she'd said the entire group wouldn't simply fit, but would be welcomed. They likely wouldn't have believed her about the temple if she hadn't produced a small statuette 42 had provided her as well as some prayer medallions. The latter had borne Laurel's likeness on one side and the pomegranate, a symbol of prosperity, on the other. It was still strange and at times troubling for Heta to accept 42's help. The fact it had been essential not aiding her sense of comfort. As hard as things had been, they would have been worse if they'd had nothing to offer those they encountered other than their word and what sounded like a mad tale of finding a lost temple. When hope failed they'd appealed to pragmatism, recounting how large the valley was and well guarded. Giving goods to prove the hermit they claimed was their patron was well off enough to actually help them beyond simple shelter. Information Heta would have been more cautious about sharing, if not for 42's true identity. We had a guest. Myra inquired when Heta returned. The Lupe who looked ready to bite last time. His pack leader is sending scouts, Heta explained before sitting down next to Myra again. The tent was spacious and the bed obscenely comfortable compared to what they'd have been able to carry normally. Access to 42's item box was horrifyingly useful. They're probably going to try and raid the valley, Myra said with a sigh. Ahem, which should be hilarious. Bunch of bastards that they are, it wouldn't be bad for their pride to suffer a bit, Heta muttered bitterly. The Lupe hadn't been affected much by the chaining. They had little to do with humans and primarily lived in animal form, which made them difficult to track even for dedicated hunters like the Seekers. Heta didn't grudge them that, but she did resent how the Lupe had refused to help other Labyrinth escape. They'd retreated deeper into their territories instead. A plan which hadn't kept them safe for long. Stronghold preferred to lead with chains, but they weren't against slaughter and had begun hunting all wolves to get at the Lupe. I hope Felix is all right. I know 42 is generous, but she can also be a bit much, Myra said after a few moments. Really? The monster who builds temples overnight for fun? Heta asked, but ruined her sarcasm with a laugh. Don't forget she also thinks farmers should live in small palaces, Myra added with a chuckle. I know people who'd live in the blasted chicken coop she built and consider themselves well-to-do, Heta agreed. The thing had been ridiculously overbuilt and full of smug fat hens who seemed to know they were living better than some people. The thought of the temple brought a strange feeling of contentment and longing over Heta like always. She'd taken Myra to see it and her lover had marveled at it, but didn't have the same sense of connection to it. It was just a grand structure to her. Humans had more gods than there were stars in the sky. To them, it was easy to shift from one to another according to their needs, the season, or just because they wished to. Not that they restricted themselves to those of their own kind. Eula wasn't human in origin despite being primarily worshipped by them after all. For Heta there had always been a sense something was missing. Her people, the whole of the Labyrinth, had barely known any stories of Laurel. It was as if they'd never shared more than a few basic tales amongst each other, let alone built monuments or places of worship. It had always sat strangely with her, it felt unnatural. Now it was as if a piece of herself had been found. It was possible the others wouldn't share in her sense of completion, but it likely didn't matter. The valley would be a safe haven for them if nothing else. I'll send a message to 42 to warn her about the Lupe, Heta said with a sigh. She didn't think they'd be able to harm the valley, let alone reach the dungeon, but it wouldn't be proper not to warn her. She'll have a good laugh about it, I'm sure, Myra said with a chuckle. Also ban and his group while I'm at it. She'll probably want a chance to spruce things up before they arrive, Heta added. Ahem, Myra hummed, drifting off again. Sleep, love. I'll let you know what she says when you wake, Heta said softly. Myra let out a quiet noise of agreement and was soon asleep again. Heta smiled and got to work on her letter. Chapter 150. Unexpected company. Down in the valley near the entrance, Dawn was waiting for me. I'd been busy before, but a week prior Heta had informed me I could expect either a group of Lapusan refugees or Lupe marauders in the near future. The latter possibility had the Bone Brigade making an excited flurry of bets about how that would turn out. My concern was more for the potential refugees, and I'd been erecting facilities to receive them. Mainly a bunkhouse complex. The one Dawn was waiting to tour with me to make sure it wasn't too weird. My first instinct had been to clone the boarding house for adventures I'd been tinkering with in my free time. That idea had been shot down quickly, and after some discussion, I'd understood why. I'd over-engineered it pretty seriously compared to what people would expect. That didn't mean I was going to make normal accommodations either. The people who would be coming had been through an incredible period of hardship. The bunkhouse would still be luxurious by most standards, but was a little closer to normal. Essentially it had racks of bunk beds and places where fabric dividers could be tied to create private units. The basic idea was the flexible location of the dividers could be used to make family spaces if needed. Each set of bunks was against an actual wall though, for privacy reasons. Every 3 sets of bunks was a break in the wall that created a corridor between the two halves of the bunkhouse. Simple but flexible. It looked weird and underwhelming to me, but hopefully wouldn't be too strange for the new occupants. More importantly, it wasn't intended as a long-term solution. Once the new townsfolk arrived, they'd be sorted into new dwellings and helped to find work of one kind or another. Dawn and I exchanged brief greetings before heading inside. We would do a walkthrough of the complex. There were 3 bunkhouses in total, so we had a fair amount to look over. I never thought about stacking beds, Dawn said contemplatively as she looked over what I'd done. Why 3 bunkhouses though? She asked. It was honestly a lot more space than technically needed for the expected group size. Families in one, singles in the smaller ones, I explained. Refugee groups weren't guaranteed to get along and cramped quarters wouldn't help. Giving them room would hopefully ease their anxieties. I see, that makes sense, Dawn said, faster than I was used to. I wasn't entirely sure why, but she'd seemed to have relaxed a bit in recent weeks. She still made the same kind of decisions as before, just more quickly and with less stress. How's your house, by the way? Need anything adjusted? I asked. Blending a space for species of disparate sizes had been something of a challenge. A narrower bed would be nice, Dawn said absently, then looked startled by her own words. Blushing, she looked at me and I tried, but failed not to laugh. I wasn't laughing at the request, just her overreaction. I honestly didn't understand why she was embarrassed, I just found it cute. That's... Dawn fumbled for an explanation and I put a hand on her shoulder. If she wanted to make cuddling in bed unavoidable, who was I to argue? It's fine. I'll make it how you want, just let me know the size, I said, trying to be gentle now, despite how I'd laughed before. She nodded before schooling her expression into its normal neutrality. An effort wasted, as she still couldn't look me in the orbs. Walking back out, we came to what I called the mess. Instead of constructing an additional complete building, I'd made a roofed outdoor picnic area with a kitchen, since I was confident the weather was reasonably dry throughout the year. The bunkhouses formed a U-shape around it, and I'd assigned some of the new skilled skeletons to it as cooks and caretakers. Those living in the bunkhouse could still choose to take their meals indoors. I'd provided tables and chairs. I just felt like an outdoor venue would have a better atmosphere and embedded a few light stones in the overhead supports. Once evening came, they would shine for a few hours so everyone could take their evening meal before going out on their own. What do you think? I asked after a few minutes had passed. I think this is much tamer than I expected, even with the light stones, Dawn said thoughtfully. Thanks, I said, playfully bitter. But do you think it will work? I imagine so. They'd likely be grateful for shabby tents, let alone all of this, Dawn said, gesturing at the complex as a whole. Well, I'm not going to slouch as a host, so that's not happening. I'm glad this will do the job and isn't too weird, I said honestly. It was the bare minimum I was willing to offer and my willingness hinged on it being temporary. I almost didn't notice a gentle chime go off and a new pop-up. Non-hostile entry. Accept/reject. My orbs flickering, I searched my map and found a group of 10 entering the stone labyrinth. All of them were in bad shape and one appeared to be on the verge of death. Mistress? Dawn asked curiously after seeing me go rigid. A party of disabled and dying Lepusan just entered the labyrinth, I said as I tried to put my thoughts together. I'd been making plans for receiving people, but I hadn't put any emergency measures in place for those arriving in a bad state. Give me some potions and put me in around a bend from them. I can heal and lead them in, Dawn said decisively. I just nodded, glad she had a good head in an emergency. I dropped her in with a cart I hastily stocked with water and medical supplies. Instead of starting a text, I went to the monster panel and selected everyone in the dungeon. A group call instantly opened up. I'd never used the feature before, but I'd figured out how it worked after the last round of upgrades. Showtime, I said simply. In the distance I could hear whoops of joy and shouting as the town sprang to life in anticipation of new arrivals. Chapter 151. The Chase. The Malthus Desert wasn't a forgiving place even for creatures bred to live there. For furred Lepusan it was grueling simply to be there. Despite that, a group of them ran across the coral pink sand, footsore and exhausted with a group of riders in hot pursuit. Ban, they aren't slowing, Ewan said in a heaving whisper. Ban could only nod. They'd been on the move since dawn and pushing their pace as much as they dared. Despite a lead, the distance between them and their pursuers was closing rather than growing. You won't believe me if I tell you what I found. Go and see it for yourself, then you'll know, Hetch's words rang in Ban's ears. She was Lepusan, one of his people, but a stranger bearing an unlikely story. One of sanctuary in the Laurel Mountains. Ban had believed Hetcha, if only in that she herself believed what she was saying. If the valley would welcome so many of them and if it was truly defensible was another matter. Still, he'd asked for volunteers and they'd set out to see for themselves. Despite a hard journey, there was nothing about the choice Ban regretted. That they'd had to draw off seekers from Stronghold to protect the rest of the band was just bad luck. Something they'd have had to do no matter where they'd chosen to go to ground. It was enough to know they'd been drawn off from everyone's families. The only thing Ban considered a bit bitter was they likely wouldn't live to see the valley. Living rootlessly as they had for years on end had taken a toll. He'd truly wanted to find a safe place for them all. "I think that's it ahead," Harry called. She was the sharpest-eyed of the group, but Ban could make out a kind of smudge in the distance against the wall of stone ahead of them. The entrance to a natural labyrinth if the astoundingly detailed map they'd been provided was correct, and they were on course. With their goal in sight, Ban wanted to look back, take stock of where their pursuers were, but forced himself not to. They'd all been running hard, and while Lapusan were better built to endure long journeys, their stamina wasn't infinite. They couldn't afford to go faster, and looking back would likely only break his heart that much sooner. Back turned to the Seekers. None of the group knew the Seekers had let loose a small volley of arrows. They'd been at it all morning, too far to land a shot, but wanting to drive the Lapusan harder. To break them all the sooner. Luck, skill, and a narrower gap conspired against them. Most of the arrows only landed near, harmlessly digging into the sand. Only one carried on a little further and buried itself in flesh. Callan screamed and fell. Joss Ban had stopped. Callan was his cousin and Joss was his best friend, but none of them was a healer and they had no time. All right. Callan was on his knees, blood rimming his mouth. The wound wasn't immediately fatal, but the arrow had punched through the thin leather coat he wore and was protruding from his chest. It would kill him eventually, even if they'd had a healer on hand and all the time in the world. It was a wound beyond the skill of any healer he knew. Ban felt his heart harden. Joss wasn't even 14 yet, and his group of scouts had started at 20 and was down to 12. They were doomed, but ahead was a rock formation that promised a bit of shade if nothing else, and hopefully a bit of favorable terrain. "Ban, don't," Callan said. Ban had knelt down and was pulling Joss onto his back. Despite his early attempt at bravery, the boy clung on as he whimpered in pain. "We'll draw them into the rocks and bleed them," Ban said flatly. He was beyond tired and Joss wasn't light, but he got moving all the same. Hope was lost, but in its absence, rage would do. The boy wouldn't be dying alone. Ban carrying Joss was the last one to reach the blessed shade of the labyrinth's entrance. He'd only traveled a few yards and rounded a bend in the trail when he collided with someone. Harry, who was standing frozen in surprise. Harry, along with the others, were all staring in surprise at a human woman with a horse-drawn cart. She in turn was regarding the group with unnerving calm, given by how many she was outnumbered. Ban figured her for a mercenary going by her armor. It was a stylish coat of leather and plates with decorative tooling. Given her colorful coily hair, likely a foreign one. "Let us pass, we're being pursued," Ban said simply. She was human, but he had no cause to do her harm. The Seekers would question her, but not hurt her. "I'm aware, as is my mistress. The Hermit of Laurel sent me," the woman replied. She tilted her head to look them over and the light caught her eyes, glittering golden for a moment. Ban's group looked at each other, shock multiplying. Those weren't human eyes. "Put the child in the cart and I'll treat him," she added. Ban nodded, knowing he wouldn't be able to carry Joss much further regardless. Callan came forward to help him set the boy down easy. Joss looked scared but didn't protest, breaths coming wetly. "He's shot through," Ban said softly. "I'd noticed," she said flatly, producing something red from a hip pouch. It looked like a heart at first glance, the glittering of glass taking a moment to register. Ban wanted to protest giving Joss wine or something more, but didn't bother. It wasn't the worst way to die, lying comfortably. That she didn't just leave it at that was almost as shocking as the way she casually broke off the back end of the arrow before pulling it cleanly through from the front. It happened too quickly for anyone to protest, let alone stop her. She followed it up by placing a hand on Joss's chest over the wound and reciting something in an unfamiliar language. Ban would have stopped her then were it not for how her hand and eyes began to glow with power. When she removed her hand, Joss's chest was free of the blood and the wound, if there was one, no longer bled. "I'm Dawn, cleric and high priestess of Laminal. You too, ride in the cart, he'll live but needs tending," Dawn said after a moment. As if a flat introduction after such a miraculous feat was perfectly normal. Right, but Ban looked behind him. They were being pursued and had been standing in awe for far too long. The Seekers honestly should have been on them already, going by how far behind they'd been. What greeted Ban when he looked wasn't an open corridor, but rather a solid stone wall. As if the path had simply decided to close behind them. At a complete loss, he looked back to Dawn and found the woman grinning. Chapter 152. Seekers. After 4 changes of horse and nearly a week of traveling before they reached the storm-forsaken desert, a cheer went up among the seekers. The demi-humans they'd been tracking were flagging and about to find themselves between the Holy Order and a stone wall. Captain Jonas didn't join his men's cheering. In his mind, they shouldn't have been led on for so long and the campaign had resulted in unnecessary expenses. 2 of their mount requisitions hadn't even occurred at official outposts and meant dealing with peasants. A dreary affair that had cost them time and coin. What little good cheer Jonas had managed to gather quickly subsided. Ahead of them loomed a mountain range, one he knew was named for some harlot demi-human goddess. Facts he was only familiar with because there was a call for volunteers to inspect it in the near future since some manner of star had fallen to Earth in the area and then a hero party had disappeared there not long after. Such losses weren't uncommon, hardly remarkable given the danger of the work hero groups undertook. What had stood out was the complete lack of witnesses and follow-up reports. As if the mountains had swallowed the group whole, bones and all. While Jonas was considering the matter, a volley of arrows was loosed and one of them managed to strike down a smaller rabbit man. Against sense, 2 of the others dropped back, one of them taking the injured one on its back. They resumed their flight then, slowed by the pointless act of mercy. Jonas saw it as an omen, they were doing Strom's work and their enemies would fall. He signaled his men to slow as they came to the rock wall. The demi-humans had slipped inside a break in the stone and his company would have to reform into a column to pursue. That's ambush country, Tim Char offered. He was the leader of the small group of mercenaries the Seekers had been forced to employ when their normal reinforcements had failed to appear. He was also a source of one of the larger expenses for the campaign and therefore one of Jonas's least favorite people at present. They're exhausted, the ground won't matter, Lesnar said with a sneer. Tim looked back at him placidly. If you say so, Tim replied with a shrug. Jonas ignored the exchange, intent on getting everyone in formation rather than arguing with the spear fodder. Entering what turned out to be a maze in an orderly manner, we were quickly forced from the standard double column to a single. Thankfully the path was shaded and led to an open area large enough to accommodate the company. Bastards, Lesnar muttered, glaring at the way they'd come. The mercenaries had been at the end of the column, or should have been had they actually followed along. Just look at it as us saving money, Jonas said with a bit of a smile. The mercenaries were paid a portion up front but the remainder came at the end. It would make up quite a lot of the expenses they'd incurred and was already an approved expenditure. They shared a nod, knowing it was the mercenaries who were fools to abandon a job when they were on the brink of being paid. Now, we'll split into 3 groups. You and Hubert will lead, Jonas decided after a few moments. There were 3 possible paths to follow, though only one had a bit of a blood trail at the head of it. It wouldn't do to go chasing the demi-humans in a circle though, if the trails merged further in. After taking some time to distribute personnel and move supplies around, 3 groups were formed. Jonas, Lesnar, and Hubert each stood before the 3 paths, a sword balancing on point held between them. They all let go at the same time but Jonas was pleased to note that Hubert had a bit of sense and pushed it slightly away from himself. Well gentlemen, I'll be going first, Jonas said with a grin. As captain, he had the honor of taking the first selected path and his would be the blood-stained one. He headed off without a backwards glance, eager to get back on the chase. As Jonas departed Lesnar fought down a grimace. It wasn't guaranteed but he'd hoped to be blessed with the blood-stained path. That he hadn't wasn't anything more than the captain being rewarded for his dedication, but it still rankled. Shall we? Lesnar asked Hubert. Peasant or not they were both seekers and it wouldn't do to snub the other man. No need, take whichever path you prefer, Hubert said with a deferential nod. Lesnar took that in and considered it for a moment. Jonas had wanted to leave the matter up to chance and thus be fair, but clearly Hubert knew his place. Very well, good hunting to you, Lesnar said, genuinely even. He signaled for his men to form up and they took the second path. Hubert watched Lesnar go but didn't signal for his men to form up. A few moments after he was free of the scrutiny of his superiors Hubert turned to his group of men. Out of 40 he'd been left with 10 and sighed at the dodgy math resulting in such an outcome. The other 2 talked about fairness and brotherhood, but the emptiness of their words always made itself known eventually. Since the captain and vice-captain are on the hunt, we'll take an hour's rest and have prayers before joining in, Hubert said. The group didn't look terribly happy until he said the magic word. There was nothing like a chance to get in a word with Strom to turn their moods right around. Yes sir, came the uncoordinated agreement. Hubert just nodded, not bothering to put on airs. He wasn't what anyone would normally consider officer material and didn't let himself forget. Low-born and barely educated, what set Hubert apart and got him in the Seekers was his ability to recite the Book of Strom from memory. An ability seen as virtue enough to make up for his other deficiencies, regardless of how he'd come by the ability. That and a healthy sense of self-preservation had earned him his place in Jonas's company. The captain hadn't been impressed with the up-jump son of a holy pamphlet printer, but he appreciated a subordinate who knew their place. While Jonas and Lesnar began their hunt and Hubert's group took a rest, Tim Char and his men were riding toward the nearest post town. "Boss, won't they spread word we ran?" Kant asked. It was a valid question and Tim could see it in the faces of the others, though they hadn't had the guts to ask yet. "Your horse want to go in that maze?" Tim asked. "No." Kant replied, clearly confused. "Well, I for one am not dumber than a horse. It's ambush country and those idiots aren't likely to come out of it alive. Besides, do any of you want to do business with Stromhold again?" Tim asked. "No," came the resolute reply. "Thought not," Tim said with a snort. He considered taking Seeker money a bad idea. Following them into a stone maze would have been the dumbest thing he'd ever done in a long career of questionable decisions. "Yeah, fuck 'em," Axel called happily. He liked traveling as much as anything and was always happy to hear they were going somewhere new. "Once we reach a town we'll pick a new territory, maybe change the company name," Tim added. That got some thoughtful nods and the last of the tension bled from the group. They'd lose the benefit of the reputation they'd built up, but it wouldn't matter much. They'd been small time and would have had to start from scratch anyway. As they rode, Tim glanced back a final time at the smudge of an entrance, hand going to his face. He'd never let on, but he'd gotten the burn that resulted in Char being added to his name from some kind of magic flame courtesy of a warcaster. Since then whenever Tim had gotten close to anything even a little magical, it would start to tingle a bit and he'd always taken that as a sign to stay clear. When they'd been riding up to the maze entrance his face had ached so badly it had been as if the wound were fresh again. He didn't know what was waiting in the shade of those stones, but no amount of money would have lured him within. Gold only mattered if you were alive to spend it. Chapter 153. Blessed Fortune. As Jonas and his team progressed along the path, he felt a kind of contentment settle in his bones. He had seen the demi take the arrow and fall, only to be carried. Whichever of its band had elected to do so must have been monstrously strong even by the standards of its kind. A mistake now supplying him with an easy path. The blood trail was sporadic, but easy to follow, even as the trail began to narrow and the day wore on. It was also getting just a little fresher the longer they continued. Finally, the trail narrowed too much for the horses to continue. Jonas ordered a brief halt to hobble and provision them in a spur of the route they were following. He also had his men take a quick meal. They'd been snacking when it suited them from their provision of jerky and hardtack, but he wanted them all focused and fighting fit, so something light was in order. Going by what he'd seen, Jonas was confident they would soon find the last of the band and finish them. The blood had been wet, and the amount was larger than before. He wouldn't be surprised if they came upon an abandoned body soon. "Sir, should we send up a flare?" Darrow asked. He was in charge of them, and it was procedure to release them in anticipation of a battle. The others would keep their paths unless they dead-ended without connecting to ensure none of the demi-humans found a way out. Jonas considered it for a moment but shook his head. On another day, he might have. Given the circumstances, he had more than enough men to deal with the demis. It might let him keep a bit of an element of surprise, not that he would need it. "No, we'll press on now. Secure your gear, it's unlikely we'll sneak up on them, but they're exhausted," Jonas said to his men. They all nodded and did as he bid. The path they continued on was rocky and narrow, scraping the unaware as they went. The blood trail continued, though, turning into fresh rivulets on the ground. Seeing that, the indignities of navigating the stone corridor were forgotten. Jonas was certain the demi-human trash was too worn down and panicked to cover their trail. They likely wouldn't put up much of a fight, but he didn't mind. Purging the unclean in service of Stromhold was honor enough, even without tales of glory. Without warning, the path led to a larger space dominated by a massive boulder. On its surface was something odd. It took Jonas a few moments to understand what he was looking at. A crude smiling face, like a child might draw, rendered in blood. The smile leered, and Jonas signaled for his men to form up as they followed him out into the open. He expected an ambush, but nothing happened as the moments ticked by. There wasn't so much a breath of wind in the maze to rustle the Spartan plant life or whistle through the stones. "They must be going mad," someone said. Jonas was startled after the profound silence preceding the outburst, but didn't let it show. Instead, he gave a light laugh, encouraging his men to chuckle as well. He would have preferred they remain silent, but he'd been too caught up in the eerie atmosphere of the moment to direct them quickly enough. "Split into 2 groups, we'll see if we can't catch them by the tail," Jonas said. His men obeyed, and they began to walk around the stone. Despite his training and faith, Jonas couldn't shake the image of the smile from his head. It was bizarre and seemed to mark the trail's end. He couldn't shake the sense they were being mocked. Jonas hadn't been pursuing that large of a group in the first place, and dummies weren't known for tactics. Still, as they walked around the stone, his unease grew. There were more paths here, 4 he counted on his side by the time they met up with the other half of their group. A possibility occurred to Jonas somewhat belatedly. The group they had been pursuing was in bad shape, and he'd assumed they were running blind. An idea seemingly supported by the fact they took off into the Malthus desert like absolute fools. Few creatures could survive in the strong cursed place for long, and it didn't provide anything in the way of cover. Jonas thought back to something he'd only heard of in whispers, that the hero's party led by that ridiculous archer had perished. Details had been limited, and few knew much about the group, but Jonas had known enough to realize they were describing Rainer and his lot. He could still vaguely recall Rainer, the stripling of a boy who'd started as an archer. Unlike most, Jonas had interacted with them a few times when his company had been chosen to train them. Or rather make sure their training had taken properly once the temple was done with them. His task had been to observe how they behaved during adventures rather than help. The memory still rankled Jonas a bit. Rainer had been selected because of decent mana reserves and his status as an orphan. He'd had no faith, no noble standing, nothing. Trash like him shouldn't have been selected for such an honor. Shaking the unpleasant memory of the boy and his companions from his head, Jonas focused. There had been a detail he'd all but completely forgotten about the incident. The party had supposedly died somewhere in the vicinity of the desert and the foot of the mountain range. Knowing Rainer was rather timid, Jonas assumed the group had perished near a town or oasis. Some place more easily accessed and with comforts for a soft bunch like them. The training should have ensured the boy wouldn't go far from traveled roads without reason. It could have been a coincidence, but Jonas couldn't help but acknowledge the location of the stone maze fit the description of where they'd likely died. Without any civilization to attract the party into the desert, someone must have lured them explicitly. It also wasn't lost on him that within the maze, a large force would have little chance to bring their full strength to bear. "Halt!" Jonas called out. "We're going to send up a flare." Jonas's men were disappointed, their eagerness for blood commendable. However, he didn't relent, his fear of what might be lying in wait for them overpowering his desire. If he wasn't just being paranoid, there was likely another band or 2 in the maze ahead waiting to ambush them. But, unlike the group he'd been chasing, they'd be well provisioned, rested, and familiar with the terrain. It wouldn't do to be caught unaware by such a group. The flares were precious, and Darrow took a few minutes to set one up. Finally, the lofting tube was set, and a fuse was inserted. He lit it and moved back with the rest of us. That was when Jonas heard something, a faint but familiar sound. The lofting tube tipped and the flare flew out, bouncing off the walls momentarily before hitting the ground and rushing about like an angry hornet. The signal smoke quickly filled the air, making it difficult for Jonas to see more than a few feet in front of himself. What he'd heard finally clarified in his memory. It was the whirring of a sling. Hardly able to see and choking on the smoke, Jonas drew his sword. He expected an attack, but in the next moment, the man beside him fell, an arrow piercing his chest. Everything was chaos then as the initial surprise gave way to terror, and his men panicked. Jonas was knocked down before he could speak a word to try and calm them, and the whistle of arrows kept up a steady pace. They'd wandered into what might as well have been a shooting gallery. Scrambling to his feet, Jonas ran and took the first path he could find. It was narrower than the prior one. Every step he took seemed to cost him a scrap of fabric or skin. It branched quickly, and he plunged ahead. His only thought was to keep the mountain ahead of him as the only reliable landmark. Without warning, the path opened into a blind alley, the slanting light of late afternoon barely reaching within. The chill of it hit Jonas like a physical force, and he stopped. It took a moment for his eyes to adjust, but as they did, he realized he wasn't alone. 2 bright spots of green twinkled slowly as a figure stepped out of the deeper shadows. Lightly armored with long pale hair, the lithe figure was strange, weak-looking even as it advanced with a thin blade in hand. Jonas wasn't a small man, and his sword was heavier. He shouldn't have felt dread welling up, but the being in front of him recalled the scriptures to him, and he stood frozen, watching in fearful anticipation. It was hardly a few yards from him when he could finally make out enough detail for his fear to coalesce into true terror. Long thin ears came to a point just past the creature's skull, declaring it entirely inhuman despite the rest of its features carrying an angular nobility. Demi-humans were a vulgar existence, hailing from an ancestry tainted with bestiality. This was something born unholy by its very nature. Jonas knew he was looking at a demon. Chapter 154. Ambition's Reward. Dusk was approaching when Vice-Captain Lesnar decided it was time to give up. Jonas hadn't signaled at any point, which meant he hadn't caught up with the demi-band. So Lesnar called a halt and had his men backtrack to a larger, more open area before setting up camp for the night. The setup went smoothly enough, but the mood was subdued. They'd tried to backtrack to the entrance earlier but couldn't find it despite marking the path with chalk. Instead, they'd found themselves lost, the way twisting strangely and full of what should have been their own marks that led nowhere. The bizarre day left everyone on edge. The most likely answer to the marks leading nowhere was that the demi-humans had been adding them. That suggested there were more than they'd anticipated, and they knew the terrain. Lesnar ordered a signal be sent up at dusk, and as the moments ticked by, everyone's unease grew. Finally, they grouped up in the middle of the space in a defensive formation, none having the heart to sleep. It wasn't so long before that Lesnar had been scorning the departing mercenaries as craven fools. Now he knew he was the fool for not stopping to think about their possible reasons. They weren't courageous, but they weren't cowards either. Bleeding a bit for their gold was normal. Their outright scorn for entering the maze should have been a warning sign. Everything seemed so straightforward when they first entered the maze. Captain Jonas had been in a brilliant mood, and Lesnar had been caught up in thoughts of his own glory. Neither of them had questioned what happened in a meaningful way. So now Lesnar was left with nothing but fear and his responsibility to his men. A duty he hadn't been thinking about for a long while before the maze or even the demi-hunt. Lesnar wanted to curse his impious ambitions. The captain had never done wrong by him, but he'd wanted to advance and lead his own company. He'd thought Jonas was holding him back to keep a capable aide, but now he could only wonder. Perhaps the captain hadn't thought he was ready yet, an idea he couldn't find a counter-argument to under the circumstances. Though he'd been required to give up his family title when he joined the Seekers, Lesnar came from a baron's family. It was enough to make him noble and win him a few privileges. Unfortunately, it hadn't come with any real backing. His family hadn't had any real wealth, just the title and a decent bit of property for the ancestral estate. Looking back on it, Lesnar knew he'd been in the wrong. He should have talked to the captain rather than looking at everything as an opportunity for personal advancement. The particular irony of it was that he'd wanted his own company so he'd be better able to serve Strom. Thinking of his god, Lesnar gave a prayer he hoped would be heard despite not knowing the right words. He also prayed for his men, though he didn't tell them. Giving them false hope of salvation felt wrong since he wasn't sure he'd be heard. Without firewood or torches, the only light to see by was the triple moons, but the brightest of them, obedience, was a waning crescent. Looking up at them, Lesnar found a touch of peace. Obedience, forbearance, and purity were their proper names, no matter what heathens might insist to the contrary. The night sky was entangled in too many lies of false gods to be considered holy, unlike the day, but the moons had a proper place in scripture. They were the virtues that were the pillars of the faith of Strom. Purity was the most important despite being the smallest, but it would grow as the world was put to right and Strom ascended above the false gods. Yet as Lesnar looked, he found he couldn't deny that the whole of the sky was beautiful. That sliver of honesty wrung a soft laugh laced with self-loathing from him. Thanks to his devout mother, he'd always felt close to Strom, the teachings as much a part of him as his bones. It was why he'd become a seeker. Getting up, Lesnar looked for a discreet place to piss. Mulling over his life choices, he prayed again while he tried not to get his boots wet. He hadn't become a seeker just because of his devotion to his faith, he could have become a priest if that had been his only motive. The truth was that he had wanted adventure and had found satisfaction in killing. Lesnar was struck by sudden clarity at that moment. He'd have to go to the church and offer penance if he made it back alive. He'd been selfish, enjoying himself rather than devoting himself to the Seeker's mission to honor Strom alone. After tying his pants closed, he looked up at the night sky again. Among the profane stars, Lesnar noticed something odd. Little dots of violet seemed to twinkle slowly. He'd never seen them before and stared up at them. They almost reminded him of how a cat's eyes would flash in the dark, but they burned steadily. Lesnar opened his mouth to shout a warning and tasted leather. A gloved hand had shoved its way into his mouth to gag him. He bit down as fiercely as possible, but the bastard didn't flinch. Lesnar thrashed, and the person moved with him as if they were incredibly light. Despite that, their grip didn't waver, and he could give a cry of alarm. In his struggle, Lesnar had turned away from the stone wall he'd been pissing against and was looking at the camp. Dark figures with glowing violet eyes were among his men, killing them with hardly a sound. Stunned, he stopped struggling for a moment and noticed a spreading wetness. Lesnar knew he wasn't pissing himself but reached down to touch the spreading warmth. His fingers came back stained darkly, and he knew it was blood. The knife must have been so sharp that he hadn't noticed the initial cut, though he felt a sting along his inner thigh. Collapsing to his knee, Lesnar pressed a hand to his wound, hoping to buy a few moments more. As he fought unconsciousness, he tried desperately to recall what little he knew of the last rites.